Okay, so, I need my notes. So my talk is called "The Princess is in Another Castle," and just want to share some sort of narrative strategies used by games. So Jen asked me to be a part of this panel, and the question that she asked me was, what can conventional online interactive storytellers learn from the successes in gaming? So just this idea that there are tons of different ways that we have interactive media at this point, but games seem to be the thing that might emotionally engage users the best. Maybe. So that is what I'm here to answer. So hopefully you'll get a sense of what works in games, and you'll be able to apply that to whatever new media practices that you use. I'm going to sit down, because then I'll be able to contain like this. Asking game designers about narrative is kind of like asking filmmakers their preference between film and digital. Like, it's really controversial. There's this whole school of thought between narratology and ludology, and like where you lie on that realm between pure gameplay and pure storytelling and all that sort of thing. So please take what I say with sort of a grain of salt. This is a huge like overview of some of the techniques that we use in games to tell stories. But I'm also going to kind of double back on some of the challenges that you brought up, Jen, and suggest some of the sort of same solution-y things. So that's interesting that we both have that. So the question is, what works in games that makes them so compelling? First step, classic storytelling techniques. I mean, you know, the typical kind of things that we teach our screenwriting students clearly have a place in interactive media, in games particularly, right? So flawed and interesting characters. This is Wheatley from Portal 2. He is ultimately destroyed by his own stupidity, and that's like his major flaw, and that's what makes him so interesting. And he's funny, and he has our empathy. So characters are obviously really an important part. But in games, one of the things that's very important is never to limit the player character. Player character's flaws can never be something that the author foists upon the player, because players tend to chafe under that. They don't like being told what they can't do, like John Locke. Obviously, supporting characters that counterpoint the protagonist's journey, so, and specifically attack his or her weaknesses. So Final Fantasy IX, long-standing, very story-driven series, typically very linear, but every single character in this game, every single character is a puppet. And that's what the whole theme of the game is about, is how do we behave? How do we know we're human if we're being controlled or being dictated our desires, things like that. So, you know, that's good storytelling when all the characters are thematically linked. That works for games. On the other side, we have Pokemon, right? Where in the very beginning you pick sort of rock, paper, or scissors out of these creatures, and your antagonist, the rival to the story, picks the rock to your scissors every time. So specifically attacking your weaknesses as a player. Rising stakes. Obviously, another really important thing. So actually, game stories seem to have the most rising stakes out of all media, it seems like. So things like, you know, Mass Effect, like, go investigate this colony. We haven't heard from them in a while. I'm sure it's fine, though. It turns into, oh dear sweet goodness, please save all of creation. All of humanity is going to be destroyed by 10 hours later. Oh my goodness. So games are very all about like the rising stakes, sort of making players feel like what they do matters in a much bigger way than just like, congratulations, you got a sandwich. But all of these things, all these sort of traditional storytelling things, as I sort of started trying to list them off, I realized that they sort of fall under the many formal definitions of what games are, right? So just like story has all kinds of rival definitions, games have all sorts of, not necessarily rival, but complementary definitions from various scholars through the past 20 or 30 years. The one that I'm going to kind of use today is from a book called Serious Games by Clark C. Abt. This is not the most popular definition by any means, just seemed to kind of fit in a most succinct way kind of what I'm talking about here. And his definition is, reduced to its formal essence, a game is an activity among two or more independent decision makers seeking to achieve their objectives in some limiting context. Okay, so that's what a game is. And as I look at that, I think, okay, so two or more independent decision makers. So those are kind of like characters, right? Characters who take actions, right? So all our characters are defined by what they do, not just, oh, I think I'm cool, but You know, Romeo is defined by his actions, right? Seeking to achieve, so they're fighting each other, right? So conflict. Their objectives, you know, all good characters have strong desire lines, right? So we have that kind of embedded in games. In some limiting context, and even our characters as we write screenplays are limited in some way, either by the rules of the world, by the limitations of themselves, by various things that happen in the plot, ticking time bomb, whatever, you know. All of our characters in screenplays are necessarily limited, right? So games are sort of lucky because games are narrative. That's my major contention, is that games always are narrative. And I don't know a whole lot about other forms of new media. That's not my specialty. But I think that's one of the things that makes us fairly unique, is because we are so driven by desire and objective and character, sort of, all of these things that make stories great are what make games great. So that's, you know, put that on the shelf. Games are awesome. You should all be game designers. Other things that are a little bit more unique to games storytelling, though. Curiosity has a very significant role to play in game storytelling. So strong world design. This is a still from a game called Skyrim. It is the 5th in a long-standing series called The Elder Scrolls. We call these open world games because while there are some designer-given goals and storylines to achieve, you're not held to them as a player. So game stories are great when they're uncovered by players that are curious to discover them. So Skyrim, people love it for the story because they say, oh, what's over there on that mountain? And then they walk over, and then they fight some ogres or whatever, and then they climb the mountain, and then they find the ruins, and then they find the damsel in distress in the ruins or whatever, and look, I've saved the day. This goes all the way back, actually. This is not just a modern phenomenon. This goes all the way back, this open world idea, to the original Legend of Zelda, if any of you guys have heard about this. This is the entire world map of the original Legend of Zelda. There's no desire given. You show up here, right here, with no idea what to do, other than, hey, look, a cave, I should go in it, maybe. And then it's dangerous to go alone, take this sword, and then explore. Find what you want to do. More recently, as games have become a little bit more experimental and social, there's a game called Echo Bazaar. Maybe they call themselves Fall in London now. It's sort of a social game. And this was the splash page for a long, long time in Echo Bazaar. 3 decades ago, London was stolen by bats. Dragged deep into the earth by the Echo Bazaar. The sun is gone, and all we have is the gaslight of Mr. Fires. But Londoners can get used to anything, and it's quiet down here with the devils and the darkness and the mushroom wine. Peaceful. But then you arrived. Welcome, delicious friend. Like, there's so much in that that drove me crazy with curiosity. Who the heck is Mr. Fires? Like, what devils? What do you mean by devils? Like, surely we don't mean, like, devils. And as you play the game, you encounter the story elements of, like, yeah, the devils from the brass embassy, yada, yada, all these different terms, and you realize, no, London actually is now literally next door to hell. Like, these are actually demons that they're talking about. Just as I played this game, literally continued to play this game, even though the gameplay was not that interesting, because I was driven to curiosity to discover this game world. Consequence is another really important facet of interactive media, and especially games. Player choices have to have noticeable and measurable consequences in the characters and in the world. Okay, and this leads to players feeling like they have a say over what's going on. Players like feeling kind of like God in their own world. Even though the designers made the world, the players like to know that they have a strong impact on how it progresses. So this is a game called Fable. It was developed many years ago by an overly ambitious game designer. And in Fable, there's a number of small choices that you make, whether it's how you play, so whether you're going to hit people with swords or shoot them with arrows or fire magic fireballs at them. Every choice you make in the story and even in like individual gameplay moments either leads you towards being a good guy or a bad guy. And that has a direct consequence on what your player looks like, what your character looks like. You either turn into this guy with the glowing eyes and the halo, or you turn into this guy with the red glowing eyes and the horns, right? So as you make decisions, you can see clearly your influence not only on yourself, but on the world. There's other, bridges that stay open and villagers that run in fear or, shout your praises because of how you play the game. You can clearly see how you, as a player, your choices affected the story. And I think one of the most if not the most important aspect of game storytelling right now, is successful games are able to balance between the player, the avatar, and the character, and explain those expectations to the player. Let me explain what I mean. So the player, obviously, that's easy. That's the real person with a controller. It's their goals and self-expression. It's, man, I had a long day. I'm just going to sit down and play Wii Sports for a little while and relax, right? The avatar is the constructed identity of the player. So the limitations that they place on themselves. So in World of Warcraft, which is, if you guys haven't heard of it, you probably don't read news. You know, you can create your own character. So there's like this troll warlock guy going on here. That's my avatar. I created that. That is the limitations I put on myself. I'm not human. I'm a troll that dictates certain in-game choices that I have or don't have. So that's my avatar. And the character is the identity given to the player by the designer or the author. And it necessarily limits the player's options, but allows for a more tightly controlled story. So this is Nathan Drake, famously from Uncharted. That's the game series. And Uncharted is essentially, what if Indiana Jones was playable? You know, there's very few choices. It's a cinematic game, and Nathan Drake is a gentleman treasure hunter, traveling the world. You know, he doesn't have a whip, but still just as exciting, right? A couple of examples to kind of help explain some of these differences again. This is The Walking Dead. It's a game, it's an adventure game developed by Telltale Games based on the TV show. So in this game, very, very story-driven. The player, obviously, you know, as a player, maybe you want to learn more about the world of The Walking Dead. So you want to expand your understanding of this world beyond the comic books and the TV show. The avatar that you choose to play, though, is the choices you make as the main character. So I'm going to play Lee as an inquisitive man. So of my 4 conversation options here, you know, one of them is, why do you say that? You know, asking questions, trying to figure out more about the world. So that's how I'm going to play Lee, this main character. But the character is necessarily limited, right? He can't say anything other than these 4 options, which is, you know, why do you say that? You know what they say about reckoning. Doesn't really matter, and saying nothing. Those are my only options as a player and my avatar, but as the character, right? He must be a murderer with a past. He must have sympathy for Clementine, the character that he encounters later. There's so many things about this game that I don't have a choice in. Contrast that with Minecraft, which, if you guys haven't heard about Minecraft, it's a open world construction survival game, sort of. Think digital Legos with bad guys, maybe. So as a player, I want to build something with friends on a role-playing server, which is a sort of a limitation that players bring on when they want to pretend to not be them, right? The avatar that I've chosen, I'm deciding I'm going to be a stonemason. He's going to build walls to protect the village from zombies after, you know, backstory, blah, 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 blah. But the character is completely blank. There is no author-imposed limits on who the that can interact with this story space. So successful interactive narrative communicates to players what the work expects for their involvement in the drama. If you were to take your expectations for Minecraft and go to play Walking Dead, so I want to build something, I want to decide something, I want to create something, and you go over to Walking Dead, you're going to be really disappointed and frustrated because you don't have options, right? I can't make Lee not a convict. Likewise, if you want to experience some kind of crafted narrative with character development and choices and the consequence of those choices, and I go to Minecraft, I'm going to be very disappointed. So successful interactive narrative, successful games narrative, communicates to players their expectations. So when we're talking about like an interactive documentary project, inevitably that has to have more investment from your viewers than just, I'm going to turn on a doco on Netflix or whatever, right? So there's an understanding of how we expect our audiences to play along. But some troubles and issues that we have in games. Obviously, storytelling for the last millennia have been completely linear, right? Even when we, like you said, even when we say have nonlinear stories, like it's still told from A to B. It just might be, you know, A to C to B first. Another problem that we face in games is that ultimately, choice is made by players, not by characters. So we save character A because he's more useful to me than character B in the context of the game, in the win state. As an example of this is a game called Mass Effect. At the end of the first Mass Effect game, you're asked to make a choice of whose life to save, Ashley or Caden. And these two characters have completely different value to you as a player, as far as in the gameplay itself. So one, this guy has, whatever psychic powers, and she shoots guns really well. Me, as a player, I needed her in my team. I don't need him in my team. And it doesn't matter if my character was best friends with him since birth, that they have been friends forever, and that this girl just showed up 10 minutes ago or whatever. That doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is I want to win the game. And so I make a choice to save her because she's more valuable to me in the game than saving him. So what that means is that any choice that is offered to a player or a user, or however you want to define that, has to be involved, has to be directly backed up, correlated to the mechanics of the game. There has to be a reason for me to pick these characters. If I was playing a different way, Caden would have been more useful, right? But yeah, choices should never be completely in a vacuum. So here's kind of my challenge, and we've talked a little bit about defining story differently, like how important definitions are. And I think that's very important. That's a conversation that we've been having in the games industry for several years, is how do we continue to define these words that's the most specific and valuable to us? And so I kind of split it along narrative and story lines. This is not by any means a completely standard thing in the games industry. We are still fighting about this. But I define narrative as a series of meaningful experiences. Narrative is something that we experience every day. It's how we reflect on our lives. It's the bigger category. And story is the narrative structure, plot, character, pacing, theme, etc., created by an author or designer. So when we talk about games, when we talk about interactive narrative, what we're really talking about, and at least according to these definitions, we're talking about narrative, not story. We're giving up on plot. We're giving up on character. We're giving up on themes sometimes. We're giving up on control. We're giving up on authorial intent. Because at the end of the day, saving the world in the story is not nearly as important to our players, users, whatever, as how I saved the world. So the actual story twists and turns, right? Mass Effect is going to stay the same no matter what. Playthrough after playthrough, story twists and turns stay the same. But what changes every time that I play a game or go through an interactive story is how that happened, right? So the runtime dynamics of a game system imbue it with narrative potential. Let me explain that just a little bit more. Minecraft has massive user engagement. Especially children seem to have no problem engaging with Minecraft. They build these ridiculously elaborate creations. People have made one-to-one models of the Starship Enterprise in Minecraft. They want to build these things. So user engagement is not a problem for them. But it's not the story, right? There is no story other than zombies come out at night. Let's try to survive. So it's the runtime dynamics. It's the fact that the zombies come out. How did I survive them this time? That makes it so interesting. I think the rise of Let's Play videos on YouTube, there's this whole culture of people voicing over their own play experiences. This sort of players sharing their narrative choices, like they're sharing their narrative. The story is the same, right? Every person plays the game, I still save the world at the end. But the narrative changes each time. It's a game called Far Cry 2. And what Far Cry 2's designers tried to do was make a narrative system where the dynamics of the game, all the different entities in the game combine to create unique narrative moments. So there's civilian units and there's terrorist units and there's army units or whatever, and each of them have behavior that dynamically will create conflict or create, help me, my boy is trapped under a log or whatever. Clint Hawking was the lead designer on this game, and he tweeted just 2 weeks ago, "It's amazing that 5 years later I still come across beautiful places people put so much care into that I never knew existed." 5 years after this game was created, which by the way he created, he's finding new moments of narrative experience. the story stays the same, right? Like it's still the same story about a guy surviving in Africa. But the narrative completely changes every time you play. And that's the potential of interactive. I am running really long. So my conclusion really is authorship in interactive media is more about developing a system that encourages meaningful narrative moments than communicating one specific idea. Journey was released, it's an independent game that was released on the PS3 not so long ago, where the story is about cooperating and all these things. And as you play, you're actually paired with a random other human that's playing online, right? But you can't talk. The only communication you have with these other people, these other players, is through like pings. And as I'm playing this game, like, and hearing the story, like the story stays the same, but the narrative changes, right? So I'm playing, and the goal is to get to the top of the mountain. I'm at the top of the mountain with this guy that I've been with for hours, right? And there's all these mechanics that require you to work together, be together. And we're climbing up this mountain, and it's snowy, and it's cold, and our characters are slowing down, and I'm like, we're huddling together for warmth because that's a mechanic, and I'm like, we're trying to get to the top, He's just ahead of me, and he falls to his knees and dies right there. And the sadness that I felt in that moment was so profound. Because this guy that I have been dependent on for hours died before I did, and shortly thereafter I collapsed. That's really sad. But I mean, that's not the end of the game, I promise. But those are the moments that we seek to design as interactive storytellers, right? We seek to design narrative moments. The story of, you know, this ancient culture that got buried in the desert and yada yada, how they didn't work together, sad, really boo-hoo. Whatever. But what mattered to me as a player was the fact that my partner just died, you know? So really, my challenge to us as we continue to think about interactive storytelling and interactive narrative is to kind of, you know, what is the princess? Is the princess making our audience cry? For so long, game designers have been trying to make the game that makes a player cry in something other than frustration. And that's been our like litmus test for emotional engagement. But really what we're talking about in design, this princess, maybe she's in another castle, right? She's in this idea of narrative design, of making systems that imbue meaning and create those beautiful moments like in Journey, or create a desire for me to create, you know, the enterprise or whatever, because of my desires. So, yeah, that's just I guess my ending challenge is to think about interactive narrative less in how we want to say things or how we want to create, you know, tell our story, and how we can design systems by which players can tell their story. Yeah.